coups, block coup attempts, end occupations, effectively disempower occupations, overthrow tyrants and dictators, and people who have done studies of this, like Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's study, have found that campaigns that are principally nonviolent over twice as likely to succeed. That is quite likely to fail, but over twice as likely to succeed. And success does not mean nobody gets hurt. And success does not mean that your violent opponent, participates and signs an agreement to have a nonviolent conflict with you. No, they're still violent. But nonviolent activism for peace and justice is more likely to succeed, and those successes are dramatically longer lasting than with violence. It's also, interesting that in the United States, people are able to talk about guns contributing to gun violence, even if we know that there are cultural causes and it's possible to have guns without gun violence. We also know that it's not possible to have gun violence without guns. But when you look at the world of militarism, nobody ever wants to talk about not just the fact that U.S. corporations were building weapons for the Nazis. And when the U.S. troops first encountered the Nazis, they were shocked that the Nazis were all driving U.S.-made trucks, right? But you have the U.S. and Russia and others pretending to try to negotiate peace in this war in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now, for example. And there's no talk of even threatening, even hinting at ceasing to provide weapons to both sides of that war, right? So there are alternatives that you can talk about in particular cases. There are also structural alternatives, right? Joe Biden could come in if he had the decency and undo the vicious punishment of the officials of the International Criminal Court put in place by Donald Trump. You could support the rule of law as well as the rule of demilitarization and disarmament and cooperation and effective partnership across the world instead of all the hostility and militarism. And these are things that could have been done to a far greater extent prior to World War II, just as after them.
Thanks, David. Another question from the chat. Many Japanese people believe that FDR knew about the Pearl Harbor bombing beforehand, but allowed it to happen to whip up support for the war. How true is this?
Quite possibly 100%, but I don't think we can say that with 100% certainty. At least it's clear that historians have not reached that consensus. There are arguments made to that effect, but I think it's getting sidetracked into a less than helpful question to focus on the particular details. We know that Roosevelt told his top officials that the Japanese attack was coming, and he was off by a few days. We know that top officials in the U.S. military wanted the Japanese to attack, sought to provoke the Japanese to attack, and thought the Japanese were soon going to attack. Which transmissions were decoded and known to whom, and kept secret from whom. This is where there's disagreement. But the fact that Japan was very likely to attack, as it did, the Philippines and Hawaii and Guam and Alaska and so forth, is not really up for dispute. And this would not have shocked anyone at the time. Most people saw this coming. There were marches for a decade or more in the streets of New York City and other cities in the United States against the coming war with Japan. Stop pushing for war with Japan. Reverse the approach with Japan. And these people were, of course, not listened to. So we know for a fact that the U.S. government was not taking basic steps to try to avoid war with Japan. We know that U.S. officials had drafted memos laying out strategies that would provoke war with Japan, and that for whatever reason, most of those steps were taken. I think focusing on what we know for a fact and what we know should have been done is more than sufficient to debunk the popular understanding.
Okay, let's go to some of the raised hands. I see all of those popping up. Matthew, you can now unmute.
Okay. All right, thanks. David, this is so great. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Greta, as always, and for Jack for organizing this. One of the things that keeps coming to me about World War II was how much of a favorite in the 1930s Hitler was over Stalin. And how the West, in the sense of Western Europe and the United States, was more afraid of communism than fascism. One example, maybe my favorite example, is up until the spring of 1940, up until around March 1940, the primary British war plan was to fight the Soviet Union rather than Nazi Germany, even though the Nazis had already declared war on the Brits. Is this something that you've come across a lot, and could you speak more to this about how so many politicians and newspapers and pundits in the West saw Hitler as a better bet for the U.S. or and for England and France, as opposed, particularly as a hedge, say, against Stalin, as someone that they could control, and that fascism was a better option to support than communism?
Yeah, I wish everyone weren't muted, and we could applaud Matthew Ho, who is one of our great whistleblowers in this country, who quit the war on Afghanistan publicly, and I think everyone ought to do that. I think one of our best known long-time whistleblowers, in a way you could say, would be Veterans for Peace hero Smedley Butler, who Matt Ho probably knows why Smedley Butler went from being in charge of Quantico to being incarcerated there, just like Bradley Manning later did, and it was now Chelsea Manning, of course, and it was, of course, because Smedley Butler had recounted a story that a friend had told him of riding in a car with Benito Mussolini, and Benito Mussolini driving over a young girl and making some casual remark about never looking back and driving on down the Italian road. And because the U.S. government prioritized good relations with people like Hitler and Mussolini, Smedley Butler went in the slammer. Until his friend came out publicly and said, yes, I told him that because it was true, right? And what I do in the book, in large part in this chapter, is quote the statements of U.S. and British officials, some of whom, like Harry Truman as a senator on the floor of the Senate, said, let's help the Russians if the Germans are winning, and the Germans if the Russians are winning. That way they kill more of each other. That was quite popular. Numerous people said that, or words to that effect. But others said very clearly, we would prefer the Nazis win to the Soviets. And that was a popular view. The King of England, who had to abandon his throne because he married a woman from Baltimore who had scandalously previously been married and divorced, there was also another reason why they didn't want that guy around, and it was because of his love for the Nazis. And this was quite popular in the higher levels of British government and ruling royalty, and in Washington, D.C. That there was great admiration, and of course it was with regrets, and yes, he has flaws, but there was all this sort of forgiving talk of bad apples and so forth when the Nazis would commit atrocities, and that became less and less defensible as time went on. But the threat to fascism was worldwide. It was quite popular in the United States, and it's to great credit of the United States that it was not as popular in the United States as it was in some other countries. It was quite popular in France, and it's to the credit of France, that it wasn't more popular, but it wasn't some isolated phenomenon that only existed in 3 countries. This was a worldwide trend. And in fact, perhaps Smedley Butler's most significant act was refusing to cooperate with a proposed coup against Franklin Roosevelt that would have installed a fascist regime in the United States, which was something that certain people in Wall Street kept trying for a number of times in those years.
Okay, moving on to the next question. David, can you talk about whether U.S. corporations were doing business with the Nazis?
The answer is yes. If you want some more information on that, what I lay out in the book, for example, IBM knowingly worked with the Nazis, created the machines that were used to catalog and categorize the people who should be worked to death, who should be killed immediately, who should be sent to which camp, how do we track, all of these victims. Those were IBM machines. And there were IBM technicians who worked on them and adjusted them and updated the machine, did the system updates for the Nazis. General Motors, DuPont, numerous corporations, worked in Nazi Germany, knowing what Nazi Germany was about, sometimes out of pure desire for profit and the goal of working anywhere they could work. Also, in some cases, out of real support, political preference for the Nazis. And I talk about, the CEOs and executives who were really promoters and funders of the rise of Nazism from the United States, and those who were, really just out to make a buck wherever they could. And about the failure of the U.S. government to really engage in an all-out effort to stop any of this illegal trading with the enemy. You read the defense. I mean, the most pro General Motors defense of General Motors' conduct with the Nazis is, well, they had a corporate obligation to maximize benefits for their shareholders. It's not they didn't do it. It's not they didn't build trucks and weapons and import necessary materials and technologies and share technologies with the Nazis that they might not even have been sharing with the U.S. government. It's that they had the obligation to do it. They weren't Nazi ideologues. They just were out to make a buck. For those of us who don't find that defensible, we don't find that defensible.
Thanks, David. Okay, let's turn to another raised hand. David Logg, you can now unmute.
Right. Thank you, David. A great seminar here. First of all, I want to say is that one thing about you is that you're not only an intellectual who brings a great deal of facts and background to what you say, but you get in the streets. Because I remember one of my big regrets was not getting arrested with you at the Senate office building a few years back, and I regret it to this day. But I think that what I like most about your book, and it's a real page turner, is that most of us in the anti-war community, and Vets for Peace, for example, we always end up getting that question. Well, what about the good war? What about World War II? And for the most part, you come up with I've come up with vague answers, but they never were satisfying to me, nor to the person I was giving them to. But with your book, it's given me like, oh my God, this is such great ammunition, different directions that go from the corporate influence, the anti-communist, and the hypocrisy of the supposed anti-Semitic America. It's a great tool, and knowing you're not just an ivory tower intellectual. You get in the streets, and I think that's as important as what you have to say.
Well, is that your pseudonym, Log? Is that your pen name? You're muted. You're muted. Well, Vets for Peace, at least in Minnesota, I don't know about the rest of the world, but Vets for Peace is a great organization and does great work. Oh, now you're unmuted.
Yeah, I am. No, they cut my name. There's a logs done on it for some reason. Okay.
I don't know why. This World War II as the good war thing. Sometimes I think it would help certain people to understand that it didn't spontaneously grow out of World War II. Like people during and after World War II didn't think anything of the sort. And it was really during the war on Vietnam that it became popular to see in the U.S. media and U.S. conversations, World War II, the good war, right? And we saw a very similar thing when the Iraq War became so unpopular that people started talking about the war on Afghanistan as the good war. Right? But if the war on Iraq had never happened, who in the world would have said the war on Afghanistan was a good war? There's anything good about it. They've never identified something good about it. It's just that it's not the war in Iraq, right? And so I think that there's this desire to not be a radical, to not be extreme, to not denounce war as a whole. That would just be loony. So if you're gonna run for president as Barack Obama, you have to say, "Oh, I'm against the dumb wars. I'm for the smart wars." What the hell is a smart war? I don't know. But this is where World War II as a good war came out of the war on Vietnam. It's a product of the war on Vietnam. And certainly the myths that are so popular among ordinary people about World War II that has something to do with saving Nazi victims and so forth, those didn't exist during World War II. This stuff is all created after the fact. And we have lies created, as we speak about wars 5, 10, 20 years ago. There are often lies created about wars long after the wars are over. And I think it can help some people in some ways to realize that we're not revisionisting, ordinary spontaneous common sense. We're trying to undo myths that were created by a pro-war media and educational system long after the wars.
Very good. And let's get arrested sometime together, okay?
Yeah, I don't even remember what arrest you're talking about, so you probably didn't miss much. I wouldn't lose sleep over that. But
okay, turning to another question from the chat. David, can you give some talking points of how to respond to the question, what if there's another Hitler? Which is a common question that people get and are kind of unsure of how to respond to that.
Well, when up through World War II, and really up through year after World War II, and the trials at Nuremberg that were based on the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the notion that the Kellogg-Briand Pact should really be adhered to, conquest was normal. Huge amounts of territory were conquered and changed hands every year, and this was considered legal and normal, or neither legal nor illegal, just like the weather, And when war was banned by the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, some wars were prevented, other wars and conquests happened, but the international community, such as it is, didn't recognize them as acceptable, considered that territory still belongs to those guys. And after World War II, the legal boundaries of the world became what they were in 1928, with few exceptions here and there. Most of the exceptions, most of the conquest, since World War II is, U.S. military bases and Israel in Palestine. It's very small amounts of land. For the most part, nobody takes huge amounts of territory and gets to keep them anymore. And nobody conquers territories as colonies and occupies them as colonists anymore. In fact, when they built the United Nations, after World War II. They built the building in New York City. They put in, I think, 70 seats because there were 50 or so countries. We'll make 20 extra in case the world goes nuts, right? And before long, there were 100, 150, 200 countries. And they had to give all the audiences seats to the countries because it was safe to be little. It was safe to be a small country. There was no point in freeing yourself and becoming a small country when some other country was just going to come in and conquer you. But when you had a shot at being independent, right? And so colonialism, with some glaring and horrendous exceptions, virtually ended. Conquest virtually ended. The application of the rule of law and negotiated settlements and even prosecution of war criminals, as long as they're from Africa, became new ways in which the world interacts. And so the fact is that the big wealthy countries have never gone to war with each other again yet, thank goodness, since World War II. They've just waged proxy wars and sold all the weapons for the little countries to fight each other. But in part because of the altered structure of law, the advancement of the rule of law, in part because of the existence of nuclear weapons, you haven't had the big wealthy countries go to war with each other. Hitler was not about to take over South America or North America. Hitler was not going to be a lasting imperial force. Hitler was not a threat to you in Iowa or Ohio. And how would it have even been done? I mean, this notion that North Korea is going to take away your freedoms. I mean, they would literally have to clone every North Korean 10 times to send them over to do the occupation. They don't have enough of them, right? It's just madness. And every Hitler we've seen, from Gaddafi to Saddam Hussein to Noriega they aren't Hitler. They may be horrible people. There are horrible people all over the world, and they seem to be disproportionately in positions of power in governments. But that doesn't make them imperial colonial threats to occupy the United States. But if it did, and if you were a believer in defensive militarism and you wanted to have missiles and airplanes on your borders, fine with me. We would get rid of 80% of the U.S. military that has no defensive purpose whatsoever, just serves to antagonize and create hostility and waste money and destroy the natural environment. And if we scaled it back that way, then you would kick off an incredible reverse arms race, and scaling it back the rest of the way would begin to look reasonable to people.
Thanks, David. We have a couple of questions coming in about Poland and whether war was inevitable after the invasion of Poland by Germany.
Well, I don't know if this is too philosophical for you, but I don't see how anything is ever inevitable that people choose to do. Things are more likely. But it's interesting that when Poland was invaded and the United Kingdom declared war, it didn't actually fight a war. There was a period that historians call the phony war, where war has been declared, there are occasional bombings, but there's no Western Front created yet. There's no big war happening yet. And what could have been done? Could negotiations have taken place? Could alternatives have been found? Of course. In that great beloved moment that everyone flies back to in their time machine, yes, but even more so the week before, the month before, the year before, the decade before, even more so. The alternatives are endless. I mean, you didn't have to end World War I by humiliating and punishing one country and extracting all the wealth, not from its wealthy citizens, but from its ordinary people, and splitting up the territory of German-speaking people and excluding Germany from the League of Nations and, refusing to talk with Germany about anything. You didn't have to do that. And you didn't have to support the rise of Nazism, and you didn't have to support the armaments of the Nazis, and you didn't have to, sit back and watch while the Nazis began to take over countries, including Czechoslovakia. There were alternatives that were never taken. But if you ask me if anything was inevitable, you don't even have to tell me what it was. I'm going to say no. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, let's turn to some of the raised hands. Gary, you can now unmute.
Hi. Just to go a little further with what you've said, I think you pretty well answered the question, but in recent times, our involvement in Afghanistan has, for some people, has apparently raised hopes. Young women going to school and the fear of the Taliban coming in. How would you respond when someone raises the question about once we've been involved in another country, how do we get ourselves out of that in such a way that we don't abandon those whose hopes have been raised by that involvement?
Well, I think it's an important question because it's popular, and I think it's a fair and reasonable question. I object to the use of the word "we" in it on a Zoom call with presumably people from numerous different parts of the world and people like myself who don't identify themselves with the U.S. military in the first person. But to rephrase it, if once the U.S. military is in a war, how should it get out of it? I think the answer that one of the most prominent women's groups in Afghanistan has been giving for well over a decade now has always been basically right, which was when the U.S. and its sidekicks eventually leave, it's going to be hell left behind, but it's going to be worse the longer they take to do it. And there's no question that there are horrors on all sides in Afghanistan. There's no question that there's not an obvious, easy path to peace and peace and democracy in Afghanistan. But this idea that you should take decades to get out of there. Obama was reckless in pretending to get out of there. Trump was reckless in promising 4 years ago to get out of there. Trump and Biden were both reckless in promising this time around to get out of there. I'm not convinced. And I think there's also a lack of imagination applied to, these very popular green pieces of paper called U.S. cash. I mean, you could transform Afghanistan into paradise on earth if you were willing to spend what you're willing to spend on destroying the place. And of course, we're not. Of course, we'll be lucky if we can get anyone to spend a fraction. But I think finding a path to a non-violent, stable society with rights for others in Afghanistan is going to require many steps, and some of which can be carefully assisted in from outside Afghanistan. But getting the military out is going to require one of them. And the idea that 20 years is too rushed is just madness. I hesitate though to speak on this question when I'm looking at Matt Ho. I don't know if Matt wants to answer this question for us.
I think,
You can unmute. Yeah, there you go.
I think it just goes back to the notion of not getting involved to begin with. That once you're involved, you're going to have all these narratives saying why you can't leave. And then it's also true that being there, you construct a house of cards. Say use an Afghanistan model. When you invade a nation, occupy it, put hundreds of thousands of foreign troops and contractors in there, and then create an economy and a government where 95% of the GDP comes from foreign sources. You've basically made it a client state. Of course you can't leave. So that's one of the things about whether it's conscious or it's not. I think it tends to be an unconscious, but it's very real, is that the United States, when it's in these occupations, creates a necessity for it to remain there. And I don't think there's a cop in the back room of the Pentagon that's smart enough to create this complexity that if we leave, things will get so much worse and everything will fall apart. But it's true that that's what happens because, again, we build a house of cards and it's going to fall. And it just comes back to the idea that, just don't begin these things in the first place because they are never, not even just for not even aspects of morality, rather aspects of like efficiency or practicality. These operations, these occupations, and invasions never work. And then, of course, the morality aspect, which is, I think, the biggest one to begin with. But, yeah, again, David and Greta and everyone, thank you for this.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, Mike Goodman, you can now unmute.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I had two brief questions. One is if Hitler was not planning on, keeping the state that he built, keeping that around forever, then why did he label the Third Reich as the 1,000-year Reich? And then my second question is, wasn't part of the problem that there were quite a few people in the upper class echelons of British society that supported Hitler quite openly, and that was one of the reasons why the politics of appeasement and why Neville Chamberlain was so popular and Winston Churchill was ignored during that period. Thanks.
Well, what Hitler envisioned and when he envisioned it, you can look at his own writings and statements, and to the extent that they are consistent, I think he was nuts. But certainly he wanted a permanent global power. There's no question that that's what he wanted. That's a different statement from he was a plausible threat to create it. I think in mid 1940 and into 1941, there were people who thought you were going to end up with a Nazi sphere of influence in much of Europe and Asia, and then a U.S. taking control and dominating the rest of the earth, and that was going to be the Cold War until it ended. But that became less and less likely as the Soviets defeated the Nazis, and one of the strange stories you get from learning about World War II via Hollywood is that the United States defeated the Nazis, when of course 80% of the Nazi losses in World War II were to the Soviets, which wouldn't have been that different without the U.S. aid to the Soviets. When Henry Luce wrote in Time magazine at that time that the United States needed to dominate the globe and have an American century for living space, as he translated Hitler's Lebensraum, that too was a vision of a lasting imperial dominance that actually turned out to be more plausible, at least in retrospect. What was the second part of the question?
My question was about the right-wing circles and organizations in Britain that advocated friendship. with Germany.
Yeah, there's no question, as I discuss much better than I can or will do here in the book, that Nazism and fascism and their own nativist forms of fascism were quite popular in these other countries, including the United States. I think peace was even more popular. I think resistance to joining in, World War I Part 2 was primarily because war is a horrible, destructive, murderous thing that kills lots of people. And, if World War I was going to be any model, spreads deadly disease, pandemics, and other forms of destruction, and is simply highly undesirable. I think that was more significant in the U.S. resistance to war than U.S. affection for Nazism, which I think was significant, but much, much less so. And I think what you saw in the polling leading up to U.S. entry into World War II was, increasing willingness to say, yes, I would support the U.S. joining the war if it's the only way to stop Nazism. And then, of course, once Pearl Harbor, Philippines, etc., happened, the polling changed dramatically, whereas the Nazis didn't. So I think it's a story. It's an unpopular story that's too seldom told. How much support fascism had in the United States, but it wasn't that much support. It wasn't the principal reason people don't like war. People don't like war because it's war.
Okay, another question from the chat. David, can you talk more about the Nazi collaboration with the U.S. government? For example, Nazi lawyers that came over to the U.S. for consultations?
Well, there's a great book on the question of segregation laws that came out just relatively recently. I'm looking for the name of it in my book. This is the other reason books are better than me talking. This book called Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law by James Whitman from Yale University. This came out actually 3 years ago. And this is something that Hitler wrote about from before he took power. The model for the world of segregation laws was in the United States. It was in the United States where you had laws that tried to figure out how to give citizenship, but limited citizenship to certain people, how to figure out definitions for who those people were. This stuff was pretty tricky, and the Nazis, did it gradually in stages because they're habituating people to horrors, but also because they're trying to figure out how to do it. And they came over and studied with U.S. lawyers segregation laws. They studied eugenics theories. I don't want to say science, with U.S. eugenicists. And this was, mutual, open, collegial collaboration with public thanking and gratitude, and U.S. lawyers and eugenicists proud of their influence on Nazi Germany. This is when Whitman wrote this book 3 years ago. He theorized that some of these topics are not popular in Germany because Germans don't want to be seen as blaming anybody else. Germany has gone to a real extreme, which in some ways is quite admirable. They accept their guilt. They teach kids about past wrongs by their government, at least certain types of past wrongs. That has some side effects. They won't talk about certain topics that are perfectly legitimate to talk about. They won't question any atrocities committed by Israel, etc. But these are also topics that people in the United States don't want to talk about.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes left, and we still have quite a few raised hands, so we will try to get to everyone. Jean Cushman, you can now unmute.
Hi. I want to know, I'm an ally of, a senior ally of the Sunrise Movement here in Maryland. And I would think they would be a natural ally of the peace movement. But the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement takes no position on war. And I find that to be very frustrating. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't have any different thoughts from the ones I've had for decades, but I 100% agree with you, or more if that's possible. If you look at worldbeyondwar.org/environment, you'll see what we think and recommend. If you look at worldbeyondwar.org/No War 2017, you'll see all the videos and speeches from our conference on this topic in 2017 in DC, where we tried to bring together those environmentalists who were willing and those from peace activism to join our efforts. And we did our kayak flotilla in front of the Pentagon with the banners "No more wars for oil, no more oil for wars." It's going back to before World War II, it's very clear which came first, right? The British obsession with the oil was to fuel the Navy. The wars came first. I think it's very, very difficult in the United States for cultural reasons to get anyone to oppose war. And it's particularly difficult to get big, well-funded organizations that are getting money from labor unions that make weapons or from foundations that fund war, think tanks, etc., or that are, and it's, but we've done a lot of articles about this, a lot of webinars recently about this. Greta and I, or maybe it's Rachel and Greta and I and others are working on a webinar with Canadians coming up in the coming weeks, because in Canada you can get the top environmentalists to join with peace activists on a webinar and talk about the interlocking nature of the two efforts. There is no question in my mind that militarism is a top enemy of the environment. I've never seen a serious argument against that. I've just seen, there are other major enemies of the environment, but that militarism is a significant one. I've never seen that effectively disputed. Just as I think militarism is a top enemy of civil liberties, or anti-racism, or anti-poverty, or open government, or anything good in the world. I think militarism is like a perfect key that brings all of these intersectional interests together, except that so many of them aren't interested in it. But then there are groups like Extinction Rebellion and many other environmental groups that are open to opposing militarism, just as there are some anti-racist groups like Black Lives Matter, or the new People's what is it called? People's Campaign.
People's Campaign.
What?
Poor People's Campaign.
Or the new Poor People's Campaign, etc. So there are organizations of various sizes and strength that are willing to join with anti-war efforts and peace efforts, and they should be supported and encouraged and built up. You can also very often find that your local chapter of the Sierra Club is right there with you on everything, even though the overarching corporate headquarters won't touch you with a 1,000-foot pole. So do reach out to local chapters of all the environmental groups, even if their big national, international names won't go near peace.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Paul Welch, you can now unmute. There you go, Paul. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to David on Palestine. It's unknown in the West, in the general population, that we refused the Jews and pushed them on the Arabs. I mean, it's horrible. And as much as you can share about that is helpful and everyone. But the question I have is, your analysis of nonviolence works before the bombs start dropping. And we have to understand we have the possibilities before the bombs. Once the bombs start dropping, after Pearl Harbor, after Hitler invades Poland, Belgium, and starts rolling and went through it, I mean, nonviolent people, you're not going to make it. They'll roll you over with tanks. So if we could acknowledge that before the bombs start dropping is the time for nonviolence, which we have now. Once the bombs start falling, I'm not sure you can't. You'll have to convince me on that one.
Well, I'll try. I don't know that I can take the full 15 minutes or whatever we have left, but I'll take a little bit of it. You're absolutely right that, again, I don't know where these ideas of we come from, but that certain government powers imposed, foreign people on the people of Palestine and ended up driving out many of the people of Palestine. But as I recount in the book, even there was also the horror of not letting Jews get to Palestine during World War II who were trying to get there, some of whom ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean. And I think it's also important how key Israel and its militarism and its crimes are in U.S. militarism and crimes, and these sanctions that Trump has put on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court have as much to do with the possibility of investigating Israel as they do with investigating the crimes of the war on Afghanistan. I'm not convinced that tanks don't roll over violent people. I've seen tanks roll over violent people many, many times. I'm not convinced that violence benefits Palestine, or that rocks and third-rate missiles are effective against the Israeli military. I'm not convinced they're more effective than nonviolence. Again, apart from particular examples, the academic studies are very clear on the trends. The nonviolent campaigns are more likely to succeed than the violent ones. These are not all nonviolent campaigns that begin before there's some problem. They are often nonviolent campaigns that begin in the middle of violent occupations and violent oppression. And yet they succeed more often than does violence. If violence is the answer, once violence begins, we're done for because there's violence in numerous spots right now, and some of those spots are close to or are involving countries with nuclear weapons. We're done for unless we break out of the thinking that violence is somehow going to be the answer because somebody else started it. I know it's not pleasant that somebody else got to start it. I know it makes us feel bad. I know we want to use violence against that violence that was started against us, but that doesn't mean it's wise or it increases the likelihood of human survival.
David, that's not the question I asked. You didn't answer it. World War II, after we're bombed, I'll grant you, your research, your insights make all sorts of sense before the Pearl Harbor, and made sense before Germany rolling through Dunkirk and England being clearly in the sights of the Nazis. Clearly. At that point, give me the nonviolent, not before, give me then the nonviolent approach.
Well, again, I object to always flying the time machine to the most violent moment, but accepting
That's what this is billed as, David. This is billed as World War II. you're giving us a defense of World War II. We have to acknowledge.
You have to let me finish the sentence. I was guaranteed to elicit that from you, but let me give what was going to be the second half. So, accepting that everyone flies the time machine to that moment, there is nonetheless all kinds of alternatives.